Why are you wearing that stupid bunny suit?
Why are you wearing that stupid man suit?
Hello, I'm Jack Morrell and welcome to Psycho Killer, the podcast for true crime addicts everywhere. As a former major crime detective, I'm guided by the evidence.
I'm Simon Ford. I'm a podcaster and a journalist, and my compass is my curiosity. Right now, I'm joined by two colleagues from my days with the BBC, Carl Cooper and Pip Watts.
We share a common bond, our insatiable interest in the dark side of human nature, and a healthy suspicion of received wisdom.
I did the maths, and between us, we have 100 years' experience investigating and reporting crime. A century's worth of knowledge in a podcast. Where else would you get that?
And so to the dark side, and a character who could easily appear in the next series of Stranger Things.
You've heard about the bogeyman, but what about the Bunnyman? The story of the Bunnyman was recorded for posterity by Brian A. Conley, historian archivist at the County Public Library in Fairfax, Virginia. Without his meticulous research, the legend of the Bunnyman would still be a word-of-mouth folktale. Brian grew up in Fairfax, and he first heard the Bunnyman story in 1976. It went like this.
The Bunnyman was said to be responsible for the deaths of two disobedient children near Clifton, a settlement of just over 200 inhabitants right in the middle of the Webb Nature Sanctuary. Others were rumoured to have disappeared, and there was talk of animals found horribly mutilated. As Brian Conley writes,
I never saw the Bunnyman myself, but then I never strayed into the woods at night, especially not near the bridge.
After graduating from college, Brian accepted a position at the Fairfax County Public Library. One day, around 1992, a well-spoken young woman came to the front desk with a question. She wanted information about a homicide that was supposed to have taken place near her home. She understood that two children were murdered by a local hermit for trespassing and their bodies left hanging from a covered bridge. She had no names and only a vague idea of a time frame. The whole story seemed a little fantastic, but the thing that really bothered her was that the killer was reputedly an escaped mental patient dressed in a bunny suit. Brian recognised the tale as a version of the one he'd heard as a child, but there was no information in the library to confirm the story. Brian concluded it had been made up to scare children, like Hansel and Gretel, but without the happy ending. Conley later wrote,
For more than 25 years, stories of the Bunnyman have been kept alive primarily amongst our teenage population. Over the years, the story has evolved into a ghost story suitable for parties, campouts, and any occasion where such tales are exchanged.
But stories about the mysterious Bunnyman refused to go away. He was written about in school newspapers and then on the internet. In 1999, the story went to a new level when an article entitled The Clifton-va was posted on a website called Castle of Spirits. This version of the tale contained much more detail, like names, locations, and dates.
In 1904, inmates from an insane asylum in Fairfax County escaped while being transferred to Lorton Prison at Laurel Hill, Virginia. According to a blogger called Timothy C. Forbes, one of these escapees, Douglas J. Griffin, murdered fellow fugitive Marcus Wolster. The police found Wolster's butchered remains hanging in a tree next to a row of dead rabbits. Griffin went on the run, and the pursuing officers nicknamed him the Bunnyman. In this version, the sheriff and his deputies corner Griffin, who gives them the slip before being hit by a train on Colchester-overpass, a railway bridge near Clifton. Eventually, Forbes tells us that Griffin was institutionalised for slaughtering his family on Easter Sunday. Lastly, the Castle of Spirits article implored seekers of the Bunnyman to see the evidence for themselves at Clifton Town Library.
Brian Conley checked the details and found a number of inconsistencies. 1. There was never an insane asylum in Fairfax County. 2. Lorton Prison wasn't built until 1910. And 3. There has never been a Clifton Town Library.
Oh, so was the whole tale made up then?
Apparently so. But to coin a phrase, never let the facts get in the way of a good story.
The Colchester-Overpass featured in the Fox Family Channel series, The Scariest Places on Earth, which retold the legend in a segment entitled Terror on Bunnyman's Bridge.
Is it just me, or is a series about the scariest places on Earth appearing on the Family Channel kind of, well, disturbing? Anyway, moving swiftly on, the Bunnyman is a recurrent theme in American horror fiction. There's even a movie, Bunnyman, starring Cheryl Teixeira, with a subtitle, Pretty Girls Die Young, in which Bunnyman is a machete-wielding homicidal maniac. Behind that dialogue is a simple message. Nobody goes toasting marshmallows in my forest. And of course, no Halloween would be complete without teens roaming the streets in freaky bunny costumes, brandishing plastic hatchets.
You know, the Bunnyman phenomenon reminds me of a character in one of my all-time favourite movies, Donnie-Darko, where James Duval plays Frank, an enormous, grotesque rabbit.
Wake up. I've been watching you. Come closer. 28 days. 6 hours. 42 minutes. 12 seconds. That is when the world will end.
From the moment he sat down to write the script for Darko, Richard Kelly envisioned Frank as a giant rabbit, man-size, menacing and mysterious, the opposite of fluffy and cuddly. Here's why movie director Jordan Peele thinks that nature's sweetest creatures are often some of the most terrifying animals around.
You know what? Rabbits, they're supposed to be cute. On paper, they're adorable, lovable animals. Have you ever gotten close to a rabbit? That thing, no, let me tell you. Rabbits, you can tell in their eyes, they have the brain of like a sociopath. If you put a rabbit brain in a human body, you have Michael Myers, the killer. There's no empathy.
That's Jordan Peele talking to Rotten Tomatoes, or Tomatoes, depending on where you live, back in 2019. And let's not forget the great British 80s band, Echo and the Bunnymen.
With the Bunnyman trope circulating in popular culture, Brian Conley stepped up his research. Was there some truth in the Bunnyman story? What concrete evidence was there? Was there more than one Bunnyman? Conley went back to the version he knew growing up, the murders of 2 children who'd been caught trespassing.
Conley discovered that, although the tale was told all over West Virginia, most versions mentioned Fairfax County. He figured such a notorious case must have originally been reported to the police, probably as a crime. Of course, with official records, different agencies have different policies about how long they keep certain documents. Researching historical crimes can be very difficult unless you have some basic facts to begin with. Homicides are capital offences and they also attract a lot of media attention, but less serious incidents were not usually kept for more than a few years. Remember, any reports about Bunnyman would have been filed on paper. Police records weren't available, and the court records were indexed by the names of those involved, not by location or type of crime. So Conley went to a section of the library he worked in and began checking the Fairfax County Public Library Historical Newspaper Index. Local volunteers had spent 10 years compiling the index of the Fairfax County newspapers, and this work allowed him to extract every murder and death reported by the local press between 1872 through to 1973.
Good grief! What sort of numbers are we talking about?
There were over 550 individual mentions of killings during the study period, eliminating run-of-the-mill domestic murders and concentrating on multiple murders and those involving children, both of which were mercifully rare, pared down the list to 3 possibilities.
Possibility number 1. Francis and June Holliber, February 1949.
Bear in mind that 1949 is the year often mentioned in relation to the Bunnyman. A lot of homes were built in the area after World War II, and Fairfax County became much more urbanised.
It would be hard to imagine a more disturbing event for a growing community like Fairfax than the gruesome murders of 37-year-old Frances Holliber and her 8-month-old daughter, June. On Thursday, the 24th of February 1949, Mrs. Holliber drove to Fairfax County with her baby and her estranged husband, Charles, to visit him at his new home, a lodge on a nudist colony. Charles reported that they set off on the journey back, but his car got stuck in some mud. After a disagreement about what to do, Mrs. Holliber took the baby and walked away, presumably to get help, but never returned. Charles Holliber spent the night in the car and got a lift to Washington the next day. He returned with his brother-in-law and a friend to retrieve the car. Still finding no evidence of his family, the police were finally notified. An intensive search of the area was organised involving Fairfax County Police, Washington detectives, and Boy Scouts. We've mentioned this practice before, and as odd as it seems now, local scouts were used as a resource in searching open ground, even around crime scenes. About 5 p.m, just as the searchers were about to give up for the night, one of the detectives noted that the ground on which they were standing was very soft. Both mother and daughter were found in a shallow grave next to the lodge and less than 200 yards from where Charles Holliber's car had been stuck. Frances Holliber had been beaten and then shot once in the head and once in the heart. The baby girl had been buried alive. The local community was horrified by the cold and brutal crime. It wasn't long before detectives got their man. You guessed it. Charles Holliber's story didn't stand up. He cracked under pressure and confessed. Not just to killing his wife, but having planned it for 3 weeks. His plan changed when the car got caught in the mud. Unsurprisingly, the jury found him guilty, and Holliber was sentenced to die in the electric chair. But there was a fresh trial due to procedural errors, and Charles Francis Holliber was recommitted to the Western State Mental Hospital at Marion, Virginia, where he was judged to be insane.
There are echoes of the Bunnyman stories. A gruesome murder, a child buried alive, kids helping search the woods, and a man detained in a mental hospital. Could this be the origin of the legend?
Possibility number 2. Minnie, Loretta and Catherine Ridgway, March 1927.
Few cases impacted Fairfax like the ferocious and senseless attack on Mrs. Minnie Ridgway and her 2 young daughters. Mrs. Ridgway lived with her husband and 3 children on Telegraph Road in Alexandria.
A man named Louis Borsig called at their residence on the pretext of seeing Mr. Ridgway. Ridgway was out. Borsig beat Minnie Ridgway into unconsciousness and then bludgeoned her daughters Loretta, aged 7, and Catherine, 5, before stealing cash and fleeing. A neighbour heard moaning inside the Ridgway house and raised the alarm. All 3 victims were taken to Alexandra Hospital, where Loretta died. Catherine lived another 8 days before succumbing to her injuries. Minnie recovered and was able to identify the assailant, who was known to the family.
Another likely candidate for Bunnyman, Boasig was arrested, jailed, tried and executed for the murders on July the 7th, 1927.
Possibility number 3. Eva Roy, August 1918.
Peter Roy was a Danish immigrant who'd come to Fairfax from Minnesota in 1912. In November of that year, he purchased 2 parcels of land near the current intersection of Old Keene Mill Road and Sidenstricker Road.
Roy, a widower, became a prosperous farmer and an active member of the Lee Chapel Methodist Church. With him resided his eldest daughter Caroline, her husband William K. German, and his younger daughter Eva. On a morning in August, 14-year-old Eva Roy left the house at around 9 a.m. to milk their cows. When Eva failed to return home that evening, her father began a search. Neighbours were soon enlisted to help, but it was some 24 hours later that her body was found tied to a tree in nearby woods. Her apron strings were tied around her throat. She had been, quote, brutally assaulted before being strangled to death. A coroner's jury concluded, "We, the jury, find that Eva Roy came to her death at the hands of some unknown person, and the indications point to Lou Hall as the probable perpetrator of the crime."
Lou Hall was a 33-year-old woodcutter who lived about half a mile from the scene of the crime. He was seen in the woods around the time Eva vanished. The case wasn't to be easily solved, however, as other suspects were soon identified and eventually eliminated. William Wooster, aged 16, was arrested for an assault on another local girl. He'd recently been released from an insane asylum, but he had an alibi for the time of Eva's murder. The next suspect was a soldier who'd deserted from a nearby army camp and was found some days later near Charlottesville. He had scratches on his face and hands and was wearing freshly laundered clothes. He claimed to have no memory of the events between leaving Camp Humphreys and his capture. He was interviewed, but after weeks of investigation, the police decided he was not connected with the crime.
Okay, so this case could be adding a bit more to the Bunnyman story. It was an awful crime against a teenage girl who was left tied to a tree. The investigation pulled in various suspects. One, a local woodcutter. Another, a young man who'd been detained in the insane asylum.
There's more. Remember the Bunnyman story about an escaped prisoner on the run from Lorton Prison? Well, an inmate named Ben Rubin escaped from Lorton Prison. He was finally arrested by Washington, D.C. police in September of 1918, a month or so after Eva Roy's death. The offence this time, a sexual assault on a young girl. On the way to the police station, he confessed to Eva's murder. Rubin claimed he met Eva Roy looking after her father's cows. He asked her for food, and in a conversation with her, he told her he was an escaped convict. She declared she would turn him up, and he became excited and choked her.
Do you remember the 1960s movie Whistle Down the Wind? Some kids find a man sleeping rough in a barn. They think he's Jesus, because that's what he said when they woke him up and startled him.
Who is it?
Jesus Christ.
It turns out Jesus is an escaped convict.
Well, no one mistook Rubin for anything other than a liar. The detectives put his confession to the test. They took him to the general area of Eva Roy's murder, but he was unable to locate the scene of the attack or the tree where the body was left. Rubin withdrew his confession and was returned to prison, this time in Fairfax. Never one to settle into prison life, he escaped again, and on his recapture he claimed that he concocted his story in order to be transferred to Fairfax Prison, where he thought escape would be easier.
I've seen it before. Drifters living hand to mouth find themselves miles from their destination, so they hand themselves in for a crime in the area where they want to go. Then they get a free ride in a police car, a couple of nights in a cell with hot meals thrown in. Not a bad ruse, all things considered.
So what about the suspect Lou Hall, the woodcutter, named by the coroner in his report?
Lou Hall was finally tried for the murder twice. His first trial resulted in a hung jury with 9 votes for guilty and 3 for innocent. His second trial resulted in a clear verdict of not guilty. So we have an unsolved crime, which is great fuel for the rumour mill.
Yes, and let's not forget poor Peter Roy, Eva's father. He died in 1938, 20 years after the murder. He's buried in Lee Chapel Cemetery next to Eva. Her murderer was never found.
What did Brian Conley, our historian, say about these cases?
He concluded that none was a likely candidate for the Bunnyman. Charles Holliber was caught and incarcerated. Louis Borsig was caught, tried and executed, and the murder of Eva Roy, even though it has many of the elements that a legend could build upon, is simply too old. It seems that Bunnyman, like any good legend, evolved over time, and we all know about that, living in Robin Hood country.
So there don't appear to have been any murders that involved someone dressed in a bunny costume. What a relief! Is it just folklore then? Is it just teenagers scaring themselves and gossiping? Has the internet allowed this gossiping to take on a new lease of life?
Almost certainly. We haven't lost our appetite for scary stories, the kind that started as warnings for children, folk tales from an oral tradition of storytelling, like those recorded by Hans Christian Andersen and the Brothers Grimm.
Brian Conley had pushed the Bunnyman to the back of his mind when, in 2000, the Washington Post published an article about the Maryland Folklore Archive. From the 1950s through to 1990, students at 3 Maryland universities collected, researched and wrote about numerous local legends. One of these was written in 1973 by a student named Patricia Johnson. The paper she submitted had a simple title: The Bunnyman. Patricia Johnson interviewed 33 students aged between 15 and 18 from Prince George's County, Maryland. The interviews revealed 54 variations of the story. A rough tally revealed the following. 14 different geographic locations were mentioned. 18 involved the Bunnyman chasing or frightening people, usually children, with a hatchet or an axe. 14 told of attacks on cars. 9 claimed he attacked a couple parked in a car. 5 accused him of vandalism on homes or buildings, and only 3 mentioned a murder. Based on the widespread geographic locations and the significant variation represented in the tales, Johnson concluded that the Bunnyman was an urban belief tale. In short, the Bunnyman wasn't made of flesh and blood, he only existed as a kind of shared consciousness. Brian Conley had a new lead, though. The first report of the Bunnyman appeared around Halloween 1970. He went back to the Washington Post covering October of that year, assuming that if it happened, it would have made the newspapers. Brian came across this headline:
Man in bunny suit, sword in Fairfax.
Jackpot.
Fairfax County Police said yesterday they are looking for a man who likes to wear a white bunny rabbit costume and throw hatchets through car windows.
The witness was an Air Force cadet, Robert Bennett.
Robert Bennett told police that shortly after midnight last Sunday, he and his fiancée were sitting in a car in the 5400 block of Guinea Road when a man dressed in a white suit with long bunny ears ran from the bushes and shouted, "You're on private property and I have your tag number." The rabbit threw a wooden-handled hatchet through the right front car window, the first-year cadet told police. As soon as he threw the hatchet, the rabbit skipped off into the night, police said. Bennett and his fiancée were uninjured. Police say they have the hatchet, but no other clues in the case. They say Bennett was visiting an uncle who lives across the street from the spot where the car was parked. The cadet was in the area to attend last weekend's Air Force Navy football game.
The Bunnyman made the paper again 2 weeks later, under the headline, "The Bunnyman Reappears."
A man wearing a furry rabbit suit with 2 long ears appeared again on Guinea Road in Fairfax County Thursday night, this time wielding an axe and chopping away at a roof support on a new house. Less than 2 weeks ago, a man wearing what was described as a rabbit suit accused 2 persons in a parked car of trespassing and heaved a hatchet through a closed window of the car at 5400 Guinea Road. They were not hurt. Thursday night's rabbit, wearing a suit described as grey, black and white, was spotted a block away at 5307 Guinea Road. Paul Phillips, a private security guard for a construction company, said he saw the rabbit standing on the front porch of a new but unoccupied house. "I started talking to him," Phillips said, "and that's when he started chopping." "All you people trespass around here," Phillips said the rabbit told him as he whacked 8 gashes in the pole. "If you don't get out of here, I'm going to bust you on the head." Phillips said he walked back to his car to get his handgun, but the rabbit carrying the long-handled axe ran off into the woods. The security guard said the man was about 5'8", 160 pounds, and in his early 20s.
So, we have 2 cases of a bunny-suited figure in the same Fairfax County community and a man with a grudge against trespassers and construction workers in the area.
Now, one of the witnesses in the research paper also said she first heard about the Bunnyman on the news after he threatened a couple in a car. Now, newspaper accounts and oral reports can be revealing, but neither is guaranteed to be totally accurate. So, Brian Conley started looking for corroborating evidence.
The Fairfax County Police Department has no official record of the 18th of October assault on Robert Bennett and his fiancée, but they do have an investigation report relating to the 29th of October vandalism incident. Although Fairfax County Police wasn't obliged to release information relating to misdemeanours, they kindly supplied a redacted copy of the report for this project. The investigation report confirms the basics of the event as told in the 31st of October Washington Post article. At 10:30 p.m. on the 29th of October 1970, 6 officers responded to 5307 Guinea Road for a subject dressed as a rabbit with an axe. The officers found no rabbit, and the case was turned over to investigator W.L. Johnson of the Criminal Investigation Bureau.
Johnson began by visiting the construction offices of the Kings Park West subdivision on the 31st of October. He found no rabbit, but did get a call soon afterwards from someone working at Kings Park West 38. The caller claimed to have just received a telephone call from somebody calling himself the Axeman. The Axeman allegedly said,
"You've been messing up on my property by dumping tree stumps, limbs and brush and other things."
The Axeman further stated that,
"You can make everything right by meeting me tonight and talking about this situation."
The representative from Kings Park West stated that the caller sounded like a white male in his late teens or early 20s. The police set up a stakeout, but the Axeman never materialised.
On the 4th of November, Investigator Johnson received a call from the resident of the area, who informed him that her son claimed to know the identity of the Bunnyman. She stated that some of the neighbourhood children who have been seen or been with the Bunnyman described him as an older teenager. Johnson interviewed the woman's 8-year-old son, and learned that he'd not actually met the Bunnyman, but had only heard of the Bunnyman at school from the rest of the children talking about him. 39 interviews with other neighbourhood children had similar results.
On the 14th of March 1971, Johnson wrote the following summary.
After a very extensive investigation into this and all other cases of this same nature, it is still unsubstantiated as to whether or not there really is a white rabbit. The only people who have seen this so-called white rabbit have been children of rather young ages and the complainant in this case. Upon interviewing everyone in this case that may have had any knowledge of any incidents concerning a white rabbit, there has been no significant information uncovered that would lead to the identity of the person or persons that were posing as a white rabbit. This case will be marked as inactive.
So, where are we in this story? Who the Bunnyman was and what motivated him to act in such a bizarre manner is still a mystery. However, the available evidence points to the events of October 1970 as the origin of the Bunnyman legend. Many of the accounts collected by Patricia Johnson in 1973 clearly derive from newspaper and TV reports of that period. The official police report makes no mention of any pre-existing stories that this individual could have been copying. Furthermore, William L. Johnson told Brian Connolly that he found no evidence of any earlier stories or criminal incidents involving an individual dressed as a rabbit. Connolly concludes that the story began to take on the features of an urban legend quite soon after the events were reported. Investigator Johnson was following leads generated by schoolyard rumours less than a fortnight after the first appearance of the Bunnyman. And by the time Patricia Johnson began her work 2.5 years later, the story had mutated in location, frequency, and severity.
So, there you have it. The Bunnyman does exist, but we don't have a homicidal maniac on our hands.
You know, I think there's part of all of us that enjoys scary movies. The scarier the better, you might say. Enter John Carpenter, writer and director of the 1978 movie Halloween. I read somewhere that the original title was The Babysitter Murders, which reflects the Bunnyman's preference for juvenile victims.
Halloween, the night he came home.
I think that dressing up and scaring people is something we enjoy too. Just think about all those mascots at sports events, people in disguise, dressed as friendly animal characters, smiling and waving at the crowd. Just imagine seeing them in the middle of the night, standing on a remote country lane.
Oh yeah, holding a gory butcher's knife or a hatchet. And that's before we start discussing fictional nightmare characters like Huggy Wuggy or the Hat Man, or coulrophobia, the fear of clowns.
On the serious side, we've witnessed the power of an urban myth to spread and morph into different versions with incredible speed, even in the 1970s. Nowadays, the internet helps these stories, these fictions loosely based on reality, spread at supersonic speed. The frenzy whipped up online by the so-called Slender Man and the stabbing of Peyton Leitner in 2014 are evidence of that.
I remember a controversy about an unsolved murder in my home city of Nottingham in the 1960s, which was known as the Birthday Girl murder. There are online forums dedicated to solving it, but other people say it never happened. Who's telling the truth?
Oh yes, the Birthday Girl. I can confirm there is no record of any such crime. Every homicide in the UK is recorded by the police and the Home Office, and there's no trace of the Birthday Girl. It never made the newspapers either, but through the power of the internet, the myth has developed a life of its own.
Definitely one for a future podcast, though.
Finally, some acknowledgements. Donnie-Darko was written and directed by Richard Kelly and released by Flower Films in 2001. The music in the cinema scene was For Whom the Bell Tolls by Stephen Baker and Carmen Day.
Killing Moon by Echo and the Bunnymen was written by Will Sargent, Ian McCulloch, Les Pattinson and Pete DeFreitas. It was produced by David Lord and released in 1984 on the Corova label.
The movie Bunnyman, directed and produced by Carl Lindbergh, was released on DVD by Osiris Entertainment in 2011.
Stuart Bailey was the voice of Brian Conley, Investigator W.L. Johnson and the Axeman. Thanks for listening. We'll see you again soon on the dark side for another addictive psycho killer true crime story.